RC family, back again. We going over ride heights tonight. I ain't forgot. I know we ain't done a video series in a minute, but back to what we started about settings on the car. We gonna go with ride height tonight. So, EKJ kind of tired tonight, man. Had a long day today. Busy day at work. So, I'm gonna let my partner tonight describe to y'all ride height. So we're gonna go over ride height tonight. So y'all hold on. Let me make sure he together now. Hold on. Let me make sure he alright. Let me make sure he good. Alright, y'all hold on for a second. Alright, we back. Like I said, we're gonna go ride height tonight. It's my ride height gauge. Just gonna go over how you set your ride height, where you set it at, what it does, when it's too high, when it's too low. So we're just gonna go over how it affects the car. So yeah, let me get my homeboy ready here. I think he ready. So y'all, let's see what he talking about. All right, y'all. Hey man, you ready? All right, here we come. All right, y'all. Let's see what he talking about.
Ride height. Step number one. It's really simple, and it's something that people check all the time, and for good reason. You should actually check your ride height every time you hit the track. If you're serious about your setup, that's what you would do. The reason is that everything really begins with ride height. You set your ride height first, then you adjust your camber. Your ride height affects your roll center settings. As a car designer, you want to design everything around a particular ride height. As a driver, you want to set everything up around a particular ride height. So it's important to set that. And since it can change during the course of a day, you need to make sure to always keep adjusting it and make sure that you're running the correct ride height. One important thing when it comes to ride height is the way you measure it. It's not so important to have the exact same ride height as some other driver and measure it in the exact same way. It's important to be consistent with yourself, the way you do it, and know what ride heights work the best. So always place the car down the same way. You see, our cars have something called scrub, so as you compress the suspension, the tires want to move horizontally on the surface also. That means that as you compress the suspension, the tires want to move in. Then as you let go, the ride height will rise up to a point, but it will be trying to push those tires outward, and the ride height will actually be lower than if you just placed the car gently on the ground. That's why you need to find a way to be consistent, so every time the same amount of force is applied and the ride height settles at the same height. That's why one of the best ways to do it and most consistent ways is to pick the car up and drop it from about 20 centimeters above the table. Typically, drivers tend to pick the car up, drop it a couple of times, everything's settled, you measure the ride height. Maybe try it again, drop it again, and then remeasure it, just to be sure that you're getting consistent results. Also, the location you measure matters. For our 8-scale buggies, I find that the best and most consistent way to do it is on the front, you measure right behind the front arm, where the flat part of the chassis begins. So there's a kick up, an angled part to the chassis, and then a flat part that begins behind the front arm. That's where I measure the front ride height. For the rear ride height, the problem is that if you measure right at the rear, the chassis tends to wear out there, so it's not a consistent measurement. I like to measure the rear ride height right in front of the rear arm. This way I can get consistent measurements, and that's how I do it, and I know what measurements work for me. So be careful when you compare the ride height on setup sheets that some other driver has done. They might have a way of doing things where they push the car down and then measure their ride height, which the car will be lower than if you just drop it on the table. or they may be measuring the ride height in a different location, and that will also give a different result. Just something to keep in mind. There are various different tools on the market to measure ride height. The simplest is just to use a steel ruler or your calipers, but that steel ruler is really good. The steel ruler is good for a lot of other things too that you adjust on the car, so it's a good investment. But in my opinion, by far the best ride height gauge is GEA, Swedish innovation. Really simple, 1 mil clicks, and you can adjust it from between 20 to 30 millimeters with the same tool. Or you can have an extension foot to get higher, or he also makes different sizes. But that system is really good and easy to use. Compact, simple, unique tool. The most common ride height settings are about 25 millimeters in the front, 27 in the rear. If you have that ride height, then that's not going to be a reason that your car isn't performing well. Minor adjustments are made depending on the track. On a slippery track, you could try raising the ride height slightly by 1 millimeters or 2 millimeters front and rear. That will give the car a bit more traction. Also, on a really bumpy track, a slightly higher ride height will help the car get over those bumps smoothly. The downside to a higher ride height is that the car will have a tendency to want to flip over if you go too high. Also, the car may start to get unstable because it ends up rolling too much and too far. So there's a balance to that. A lower ride height is especially good on high grip because it actually does the opposite. So a lower ride height will be less likely to flip over or get unstable because it rolls too much. It also reduces grip slightly. But the downside to a low ride height is that it doesn't handle the bumps as well, and also it doesn't jump and land as well. That's another benefit to a higher ride height. It definitely jumps and lands better. Most of the time, drivers tend to stick to a set ride height that they have figured works good on their car, and they don't really adjust it too much going from track to track. Another thing that drivers do is they tend to run the front a bit lower than the rear. If you increase that, rake is what it's called. So if you lower the front even more compared to the rear, you can find that you have a bit more steering into corners, and the car will corner in a more balanced fashion. If you go too low on the front, you'll lose too much traction on the front end, and the steering just won't feel consistent. If you go too low on the rear end, you'll lose rear traction, and the rear might begin to slide in corners. Sometimes something worth trying is if you're on a really rough, difficult track, you might want to actually raise the front end and have it slightly higher than the rear end. This is not normal or common, but maybe trying something like having 29 front ride height and 27 rear could actually make the car even more stable, where it just goes over the bumps really nicely and the steering is a bit smoother, so you have a bit less initial steering. It could actually make your car easier to drive in these conditions. Also, as I already mentioned, everything is tuned and adjusted to a set ride height. So if you do make big changes in your ride height, if let's say your home track is really bumpy and rough and you've found that running 29 ride height front and rear is the best, if you then go to a high grip smooth track where normally a ride height more like maybe 25 front, 27 rear is better, when you do that, you actually need to readjust some things. Camber change, you remember that? With a lower ride height, your static camber will actually increase. So you would have to readjust camber, reducing camber slightly. Another thing is roll centers. So if you lower your ride height a lot, you're also lowering your roll center. So now your car may not feel as good as with that higher ride height. You may need to readjust your roll center settings. So raising your roll center slightly to adjust for or to compensate for the lower ride height. The best way to do this would be to lower the links on the shock towers to angle the link more. This is actually one reason why drivers don't tend to change ride height too much. They spend a lot of time at the track adjusting everything around a certain ride height, and the car works with that ride height. This means that changing your ride height a lot from track to track will throw all those settings off a bit. That's why it's important to stay close to your normal ride height setting and only change it maybe 1 mil, maximum 2 mil in either direction. But as I said before, remember to check your ride height because it's easy to forget to do. You use different tires, they are different sizes, you change springs, you change shock positions, you make all kinds of adjustments of the car, and they tend to have an effect on ride height also. So remember to check your ride height.
Well, remember to check your ride height. And again, like I said in my other videos, all this apply to fifth scales. Apply 1/8 scales, buggy and truggy, and your monster trucks, and your sedans, on-road car, off-road cars. So, hey, that's ride height. Alright, y'all, EKJ 24,000. If you ain't ripping, you're tripping. Hope y'all like that. Y'all stay tuned for the next settings we're gonna go over on the cars. So we're just trying to get everything tuned in for the summer. So treat people the way you want to be treated. Let them haters be your motivators. Actions speak louder than words. Alright, y'all. Later.